she was talking about the trap that people in the service industry, people that help the caretaking industry, can easily fall into, which is that of rescuing others and getting caught up in the rescuing thing. And as a person that was working with AIDS patients at the time, this woman, Judith, she realized she was getting caught up in the dramas to such a degree that it was affecting her peace of mind and her sanity.
Welcome back to the Consciousness of the Way. I'd like to welcome to the podcast today an incredible wisdom teacher who spent his life exploring something that's so magical, the desire that gives you a blueprint of your alignment with the universe, deep into the stars and the cosmic connection. I want to welcome to the podcast astrologer, author, and incredible teacher, Ray Grasse. How are you, my dear friend?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
And so we were talking more about how obscure things just come up in conversation. Can you hear me? How's that?
Yeah, I was turning the volume up on my end, but go on.
Yeah. So for all the people that are new to this interview, and of course yourself, maybe we want to give them an abbreviated summation of your journey to this very moment.
Okay. I had my start in the arts, really, with had my degree in filmmaking and painting from the Art Institute of Chicago, but I've always been interested in the esoteric and spiritual. And it was while I was in college that I learned about I had been studying in my teens, the usual sorts of books that a lot of teens learn about these esoteric ideas through, such as Edgar Cayce and Lobsang Rampa and mystery books on Egypt and various odds and ends. But I started studying with a actual yogi when I was 19 in Chicago, Chicago-born teacher. His name was Melvin Higgins, but his Swami name was Goswami Kriyananda. Studied with him for about 15 years, and he was in the Kriya Yoga tradition. And then I heard about his teacher, who sounded like a remarkable figure, mysterious figure, not at all into fame or recognition, and so it was very private, and he didn't even have a phone. But I managed to procure a meeting with him in 1977, September of 1977, and then another meeting, and then another meeting. So I wound up studying with him for a while. A very occult guy, somebody I know referred to him as kind of a cross between Aleister Crowley and Albert Einstein and Yoda. And that's not far off. But I've often said he's very much of a Merlin figure. He looked like a Merlin figure. He acted like a Merlin figure. He had that foot in the mystical world as well as the occult world, and they're not necessarily the same. And but then I wound up, after studying with Kriyananda, went off to a Zen monastery in upstate New York, a Zen mountain monastery in the Catskills, and studied with a really good teacher there named Dido. His American name was John Lurie, but his Zen name was Dido, D-A-I-D-O, and it was there for about 5 months. And I did that because even though Zen is on the surface very different from Kriya Yoga, they're both trying to point you towards awakening. So there's a commonality with these schools usually in terms of that ultimate goal, so to speak, if that's the right word, and I'm not sure it is, goal. So that was a great experience for me in terms of the reason I really went into the Zen monastery was I felt I needed discipline, and I needed to have someone with a whip, over me, kind of forcing me to sit still, because sitting still is really a key part of it. You can be, I've seen people in certain schools of meditation where they're, kind of moving around and scratching and all this sort of thing while they're meditating. But that's, I'm not sure, might be relaxing, but I'm not sure that's really, well, certainly not a certain kind of meditation. And this is all going on while I was learning astrology. I started astrology at the same time that I started studying with Kriyananda. And then I got very obsessed with, at the time, with synchronicity and symbolism, and reading Jung and everything on synchronicity that I could read, and the theory of correspondences, and, you know, the occult side of, you know, the ritual and all this. So this all kind of came together for me. And when I wrote my books, I've now, my 10th book just came out a few months ago, In the Company of Gods, my second book about Shelley Trimmer, who was that Merlin type figure down in Florida, the kind of quasi-recluse mystic occultist. And my books have been an attempt to kind of, it's not easy to kind of summarize all that experience, but there are certain through lines with it, such as symbolism and awakening and the chakras and all this sort of thing. And so it's been a constant effort to kind of figure out what it's about and to increase the clarity of my awareness. I'm not sure that expanding consciousness is where it's at. And what I mean by that, like, you know, I experimented quite a bit with drugs when I was younger, hallucinogens and all that. And I think it's an important stepping stone for a lot of people, and it was for me. But an important insight for me was realizing that it isn't all about expanding consciousness. It's about balancing consciousness too. For example, the analogy I use is that Adolf Hitler undoubtedly had a more expanded sphere of awareness than the worm in his garden, for example. You know, a galactic awareness compared to that worm, but was it more balanced awareness? You know, you can expand, like Shelley Trimmer used to say. It was a very important teaching for me to hear. He said that, you know, there's a difference between evolving on the wheel, is the term he used. That's on the chakras in the right or left hand side, Ida or Pingala. And that's the power principle. That's you can rise up to the level of gods, if in terms of, you know, that expansion of consciousness and the expansion of power. But he said the mystic path is more so Christ-like in nature. And he wasn't Christian, but he was using that as a good way to illustrate it. And that has to do with the awareness in the middle of the spine, Sushumna. And that the balanced awareness, the straight and the narrow, which is a path that's very easy to fall off of because you can get so tempted by fear, desire, hatred, you know, whatever, pleasures, whatever. Not that those things are bad. That's not the point at all. It's about being in control of those impulses and those phenomena, so to speak, rather than them being in control of you. And so ever since I really learned that from Shelley in particular, that idea of the path of balance is where it's at, my life has really been about not so much, you know, the expansion, though that I think has its place, as it is about, you know, walking that path of balance and trying my best, often falling off, but realizing that's where it's at. So I don't know if that gives you some beginning orientation there, but that's how I'd sum it up offhand.
Oh, it's fascinating because it really hasn't changed. The messaging, or perhaps the interpretation, might have varied somewhat as a contemporary version. In essence, I believe most people today just wake up having a state of awareness that goes beyond their nose, and they go, "Wow, I can hear grandma, I can see visions, I'm one with the universe," and that's enough to spark some type of desire to open up a YouTube channel and talk about spirituality. That's a great start, but the stuff that you're speaking on, in my opinion, is a mastered state of unity that I would suggest everyone experience once in their natural born biological lifetime, as opposed to just contemplation and you know, the idea that maybe if I think hard enough on this, it's going to materialize as some awakening, which doesn't happen for most people because they're stuck in a programming that makes their life extremely miserable and boring and very 3D like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. You know, it gets easier as you get older, in the sense that you're so driven by emotions and desires and fears when you're younger. And I'm still driven by emotions and desires and fears, but not to the same degree when you're 20 or 30 even. I think there's a natural reactivity where you're throwing gasoline on the fire at everything that comes up. And one of the nice things, it's also, you know, it's got its downside, but one of the nice things about getting older is that there isn't quite as much, at least not in my experience, as much reactivity and that instant emotional sort of thing. It's one of the things that Shelley in particular emphasized with me. He was very good at pushing buttons, and not in a crazy wisdom way of, like, you know, abusing the student or whatever. I've seen those, and that's really tragic. With teachers excuse bad behavior by saying, "Oh, it's crazy wisdom. You know, you should, you know, like it." But one of the things he taught me was this idea of, how do I explain this? Well, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle here. Meditation is really important. But there's different kinds of meditation. There's like witnessing style. There's pure sitting, shikantaza, they might say in the Zen tradition. There's different techniques that you might use. Visualization techniques, mantras, breathing techniques, conceptual techniques like koans. They start out conceptual, they don't end up that way. But years ago, a friend of mine made a really interesting comment. He was a fellow student at the Kriya Yoga Center that I was studying at. And there were people, there were a few of us that were wanting to know about these special techniques. The teacher would refer to some special Kriya technique. And there's this certain, what Trungpa would have called spiritual materialism, a sense of wanting to get more techniques and better techniques. And I've got one that you don't have, and that sort of nonsense. And what my friend Frank said, which I thought was really true, he said, fuck it. It's really, you have to live your life. You might meditate for, let's say, 30 minutes a day. For some people, it's 15. For some people, it might be 2 hours. But the rest of your day has to be spent in your ordinary awareness, just being a decent person, a balanced person. And you'll bump into people that I genuinely think they're awakened. They've had the enlightenment experience, but they don't necessarily have their life in order. There aren't necessarily great people. There's too many stories, and I won't mention any names. I've certainly heard plenty of them. I've seen a few where teachers that were really genuinely high teachers, high in the sense of spiritual elevation, and yet they fell. The higher they are, the farther they can fall in terms of fooling around with, not only just, let's say, getting a student pregnant, but giving AIDS, knowingly giving AIDS to students, for example. Where's the enlightenment, come in handy for that? I've had these discussions with this friend of mine who I met. He was 19 years old at the monastery, my friend Ray Bonini, and we have these talks to this day. He's the one person I've kept in touch with, excuse me, from the monastery. And now he's quite a bit older like I am, but he's very sharp. And we've been having these discussions about, does becoming enlightened automatically confer ethics? And no, it doesn't. I think that in becoming awakened or enlightened does ideally bring about a certain compassion and a certain kind of empathy and understanding. But there's just too many stories of teachers who have fallen off the wagon and done horrible things. And so you have some schools, like, for example, my friend Ray, who was much more into the Tibetan yoga, Tibetan meditative tradition, he was saying these different schools of Tibetan practice, like the one that the Dalai Lama Gelugpa, I think it is, the tradition of the Dalai Lama is in, does emphasize ethics quite a bit. But there are other schools in the Tibetan tradition that do not emphasize it so much. And so they might rationalize certain behaviors as crazy wisdom, you know, and maybe even do what an outsider would consider abusive behavior. And so I've become more focused as I've gotten older in really just trying to get my ordinary life somewhat balanced, and kindness and compassion and sharing knowledge where it's useful, but not really caring whether or not, you know, it's going to change someone's life. It may or may not, you know, do that. If it does, it's fine. But, you know, I've let go. I'm not an enlightened teacher, so I'm not going to pretend like I am, but I'm not as obsessed with that as I was when I was younger. If it doesn't happen in this lifetime, fine. And if it does, great. But I'm more concerned with the rest of my life outside of that time I spend actually meditating and just trying to get my life in order and, you know, do what I can to help the world, to heal the world. So that's one take on it.
Yeah, it's fascinating how people find themselves, and I always tell people you know, to be realized doesn't require you. And most people get that paradox is way too confusing. The idea that their identity that looks back at them in the mirror is really has nothing to do with a self-realization of unified state of awareness. Yet we like to be myopic and humanistic, which is a beautiful thing because that's the gift of what this whole experience is about. Yet people move away from it like they want to be realized as the next coming of Jesus, the supernatural healer. This is more common these days from my own experience, having taught internal alchemy for over 30 years. I realized that people become very obsessed with what we call one facet of the diamond. So instead of a full embodiment that is you are all things and nothing at the same time, which is a head screw for most people, but at a certain developed level, you'll understand that you can have your cake and eat it, but you must be able to live and breathe these things in this, what we would call, my monk friends would call the mundane reality, and get on with this experience of your life as human, as an expression of that. And furthermore, being able to implement these superpowers that humans have, the sentience and the empathy that, when tuned to humanity's core, will really raise an awareness that most of these spiritual teachers keep banging the drum on, and you know, attempt to lead someone in the direction of, you know, healing or self-realization, but they just get corrupted by more, you know, as you would say. I have met 3 people in my lifetime that can levitate. 2 of them were Kundalini masters in Indonesia. 1 was one of my students. And all 3 of them had very much a personality deficiency. Quite frankly, they were assholes. Mastering energy doesn't make you an ascended, enlightened being of the universe and awareness of God, source, Tao, Buddha, however it is. It just gives you insight that this material is accessible to play. And what you do with it, again, is like it can be used within this material state of good or evil. This is the potential that we're looking at with the energy, is what do you want it to be? And that's where that, I imagine you're referring to some type of a moral code where someone can start to make sense of this and they don't abuse their power.
Yeah, like, for example, I remember reading about, when I was at the monastery, I read an article, a critical article on Zen in Japan during World War II, and how some of these people had gone from the monastery to being these fairly ruthless generals, or, you know, out on the front lines. And, you know, that clarity and that one-pointedness was great in some ways, as far as that decision making and the ability to do things on the battlefield that took really kind of diamond sharp sort of awareness, but it wasn't compassionate necessarily. And that fortunately there are these schools of Zen that don't just practice clarity of consciousness and one-pointedness and all that. There is also that emphasis on the heart. The one thing I didn't notice as much in the Zen tradition was an emphasis on heart, sort of chakra, compassion. It is there, fortunately, but there are some schools in of Zen that don't emphasize that at all. And I think that's where the ethics have to come in. And I also don't want to sound like I'm downplaying the meditative practice side of it. I don't mean it to sound like that. I think that it's the ultimate is when you incorporate practice into the other 23 hours of your life, of course. And how do you do that? You know, how do you incorporate practice? Is it about running the mantra through your head while you're washing the dishes? Is it about watching your breathing all the time? I'm always, one thing that I've really been doing a lot lately, because it's fascinating to see how dysfunctional my brain is, with watching the things that push my buttons. So I'll be scrolling across social media and I'll see a political opinion I don't like, and suddenly my blood pressure just goes through the roof. And I realize, wait a second, why is it that triggers me like that? And, you know, how do I stop that process? You know, and one of the key things is obviously you slow down the breathing. I remember years ago hearing a lecture by a wonderful teacher, and she was talking about, this is relevant. It may not sound like it at first, but it is. She was talking to a bunch of therapists that were working with AIDS patients. And she was talking about the trap that people in the service industry, people that help the caretaking industry, can easily fall into, which is that of rescuing others and getting caught up in the rescuing thing. And as a person that was working with AIDS patients at the time, this woman, Judith, she realized she was getting caught up in the dramas to such a degree that it was affecting her peace of mind and her sanity, because she was seeing things happen that were not only painful to watch, but in some cases unethical. And I won't go into details about that. But someone asked her that was listening to the talk, said, how do you tell when you've crossed that line into the rescue mode? Let's say you're talking to someone and you're trying to help them out. And then you get into that codependent thing where you've crossed the line into getting sucked into their drama, and now it's thrown off your clarity. She said a very interesting thing. She said, watch your breathing. Because as soon as you cross that line into the rescue mode, the unhealthy rescue mode, there's a good thing about rescue, but there's an unhealthy side to it, which is where you've kind of given up control and you're kind of just unwisely kind of getting sucked into it. And she said, watch your breathing. And ever since I heard that, I followed that. When let's say it could be something I read on Facebook. It could be someone calling me at 11 o'clock at night with a problem. How do I know when I've lost the clarity, or I've lost my center? And that's where the breathing comes in. I see the breathing tightens up. And so I slow down the breathing and I start, opening up the lungs a little bit, and I stand back a little bit. And it doesn't mean I don't help the person. It doesn't mean I don't try to, do what I can. It just means, this is another related, I think, example. I was driving down the road with a friend in town here, and I saw a kid on a bike come out from a side street into the middle of traffic, and he gets hit by the car coming from the other direction, and at a fairly good speed. It was a big vehicle, an SUV or something, and it was a heart-stopping thing to see. It was one of the most painfully, almost traumatic things I've ever witnessed in my life. And without going into gory details, he did survive, but it took him a year. I saw an article about the kid a year later in the paper, how he had brain damage and all this, and he was in a wheelchair, but he did survive. But the thing that was useful about the experience to me was the car in front of us. There was one or two cars in front of us to where this accident occurred with the guy on the bike. The gal in the car in front of us, as soon as this happened, everybody was in shock. It was at this crowded intersection. But the woman in front of us got out of the car calmly, went over and tended to the kid. And it turns out, I spoke to her later, it turns out she had been an emergency room nurse. So she was used to emotional situations. So she didn't get plugged into it. And it gave her, they talk about, well, if you're going to be detached from situations, that means you're going to become cold and indifferent. Well, there is a cold kind of detachment, but there's also a compassionate sort of detachment where you're just in a centered space. And that woman was able to do more than everybody else in that, in all those cars, because she was more centered and detached, yet wasn't cold. She wasn't lacking compassion. In fact, she was the most effective person in that situation. And that was a great lesson for me, to see how this woman coped with situations without getting emotional. But it didn't mean she was dead emotionally. It didn't mean she was cold. She was actually better at what she had to do than everybody else was. I forgot where I was going with that, but there's a point in there somewhere related to what we were talking about.
Well, for me personally, that would refer to what we call the Wu Ji, which is the primordial mother, the animation to the pulse to everything. It's the pulse to the consciousness. The consciousness is the pulse to the spirit. The spirit's the pulse to energy. Energy is the pulse to the body. And so you sort of go up and down the crescendo of these self-realizations. But the present moment is the only time I've ever witnessed any form of miracle or something that would be considered a moment of empathy that would result in some form of healing, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And we call it the point of no return, where you detach and then attach as all things. So you're speaking on this moment where you're no longer being commandeered by the attention of such ego, personality. You are in that present moment to be in service. The servitude, the selflessness instantly is accessible. That's a mastered cultivational state, in my opinion, that you will know when you have become part of this unified state, when you are just selfless. And it doesn't require a thought processes. It's kind of like autonomous action. The autonomic nervous system is evidence of that pulse that we speak of, yet everyone takes it for granted. The idea of breathing, walking, blood pumping, this is this potency we're speaking of, and it's happening now. And this is where I always come back to, you are not required to be self-realized. And people get really perplexed by that. It's like, hey, whoa. What does that really mean? It means that the second you observe in what we would call an observer position, and we're no longer meeting it with the finite mind, the corrupted, bankrupt intellect, you realize that you have access to this autonomous state, the pulse, this substance, we call a substance, and it is unified. It's not separated by yin and yang potential. And when you access that fluidity, there's this pulpability to it. And you're like, oh, hang on. And this is what we refer to within Taoism as called Wu Wei, effortless action, effortless effort. And so your friend or the person that
You froze up there.
Are you there?
Yeah, you froze. Your image. There we go. Now you're back.
Yeah, we refer to it as a resonance. So the resonance makes it possible, and that's a cultivational practice. And it's something that you acquire through your own self-realization and mastery. But it really happens where you witness miracles where the mother's child was caught under a car, and next minute they have superhuman strength, where you can't make sense of how someone could access that state. That would be an example of that.
Yeah, I wrote an article. It's a chapter in one of my books. I think the title of the chapter, the essay, is something like Avatars, Channeling, and the Avatar's Genius and the Channeling Principle, something like that. And I used the analogy, I think I used it in that one, where let's say you see a musician let's say take Eric Clapton as a guitar player, for instance. And a musician, a master musician, they learn the basics of the craft. And then there comes a point when they tap into something higher that takes over, so that when a musician, let's say, is improvising, you'll see a musician like Clapton or Stevie Ray Vaughan or whoever, Jeff Beck, in a moment of real inspiration, something takes over. And they more or less are along for the ride, and the fingers are doing what the fingers are supposed to be doing, but they're not having to think of what those fingers have to do because they're flowing. It's a state of flow. And that can be in any field, whether you're a carpenter or a mystic or a painter, where you master the basics to the point where something higher takes over. You know, the Greeks might have used the word daimon or whatever. And it's an uncanny thing to watch with people in the arts or whatever. But when I think you develop a certain level in your practice of doing the techniques and the practice and the everyday awareness. At some point, a similar thing takes over, similar to, I think, the Wu Wei thing you were talking about, where it's not so much a calculated process anymore. It's more of an intuitive process. And you'll see teachers, it's particularly, I've never been involved, unfortunately, with martial arts, but when you see a really great martial artist and they're in the moment and they have to do things, they're acting purely from that state of channeling, you might say, that higher awareness. And they don't have time. It's a funny thing. One of the things that Dido at the monastery said, they tried to have a restaurant going in nearby Woodstock, New York, and it failed because he said that all the Zen practitioners that were working at the restaurant were working very slowly. And he said, being aware, being in the Zen state is not about doing everything really slowly. He said that the samurai warrior in the middle of a fight can't be going really slowly. He's got to be right there in the moment, working as fast as you need to. And he was trying to tell the cook and the bus boys and all this, to try to speed it up a little bit, but try to keep your awareness. And they couldn't quite get that. So the restaurant didn't last, but that was a great lesson for me.
Yeah, it's always profound when we refer to it as there's a million ways up the mountain to be realized, to realize that self is not even part of the equation. It's more a corrupted fringe benefit of the external state, that really when you are at one with everything, it doesn't require any attention whatsoever, any intellect. Right. And that becomes mastered for me. That's very much the ancient ritual of cultivation for the alchemical process. And you become very, very skilled at harnessing any energy potential at will, which turns you into someone that could technically intercept things. And then that brings us to this fundamental crossroads for most people. They call it the karmic model of self-realization. What does that really mean? I think is an interpretation, because interpreting what is a gathering of development of your biological experiences, and they may reference past lives, or you get into all these perceptions. What evidence does it give you that makes it true to you and is your absolute truth, as no one else can hand that to you? That is a very interesting path. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't want to forget to mention while I'm at it that Shelley, the teacher in Florida, he died in '96. He spoke about alchemy occasionally, and that's not a field that I'm an expert in, but the one thing he did say that really struck me was each of the chakras has a metal associated with it. And so the root chakra is Saturn, that's lead. And the second chakra is tin. The third chakra is iron. The fourth chakra, the heart chakra, is copper. The throat chakra is mercury or quicksilver. The third eye is gold. And that he often talked about one of the ways of interpreting the alchemical process is the transmuting of lead to gold, is raising the energies from the base chakra up to this point there, and then back down again. You don't want to just leave it up there. And he had a very sophisticated model of the chakras and the various currents or nadis that I hadn't heard anyone else talk about quite the same way. And that was, he said that each chakra has a masculine side, an extroverted expression, a feminine side, an introverted emotional expression, and a balanced expression in the middle. And that the real balance of climbing the ladder is bringing the energies into the middle of the chakra, the sushumna, and then raising it up. And that you might even experience, for example, in some of the Kundalini techniques that they have in those traditions, you might be lifting the energies up and you feel it veer off at a certain point, then it comes back and you realize there's an energy angulating off at one particular chakra, which you can see in the horoscope, by the way, if you transpose the horoscope onto the chakra system, and that's a whole other thing. But the straight and the narrow, so to speak, he referred to that outer portions of the chakras as the wheel, as I said before, the wheel of rebirth, the wheel of desire, of fear, and all this, and that's that middle point there that's so hard to keep balanced in. And so getting back to what I was saying about the woman in the car in front of us when we saw the kid on the bike, it's part of that effort of how do you bring practice into your everyday life? So that it's not just something you're doing for 15, 20, 30 minutes a day, however long that could be, for 2 minutes a day. That's even valuable. But how do you bring that into the rest of your life? And one of the things I feel is keeping that energy centered in the middle and constantly watching to see, like when I'm reading that political opinion on social media that sets me off, and I can literally feel the energy going off from the middle of my spine. And I go, wait a second. And I have to kind of consciously bring it back in there. And anyway, I thought that was useful. For me, that's been an invaluable part of his teaching, the notion of the straight and the narrow, that middle point. But also the other thing that I learned from him that I found very helpful, from his student Kriyananda as well, Goswami Kriyananda, that I just today, in fact, I was looking at a blurb for someone online, a kind of a new agey sort of teacher talking about balancing your chakras, and that you buy special crystals to help balance your chakras, or you might do certain rituals or whatever. But really, when it comes down to it, on one level, and I'm simplifying things, but I think it makes a point, the balancing of the root chakra isn't about some esoteric thing necessarily. Yeah, there's a certain techniques you can do, but it's really about balancing your earth life. The second chakra, which is the water level, and there's disagreement about what the second chakra is about. You could do certain esoteric techniques. You can, put crystals around your apartment or whatever it might be, but it's basically about balancing your emotional life and watching out for addictions, whether that's alcohol or pot or whatever it is. And then the third chakra is the Martian chakra. And that's, again, there's esoteric visualizations you can do involving fire or the color red and all this. But it's really about balancing your anger, balancing your assertiveness, knowing the right amount of drive to have in life, your energy levels. The fourth chakra, again, there's esoteric occult techniques that can be done, but it's about balancing your love life in terms of compassion. The throat chakra is really about balancing your speech, balancing your right thought, is the way the Buddhist might talk about it. And balancing this chakra there, again, there's complicated esoteric techniques and mantras, but it's about really balancing the ego principle to a certain extent, the power principle. And I'm simplifying things greatly here, but those are all things that have been useful for me in trying to understand how do you bring these things into everyday life.
Yeah, it always comes back to something as primordial and as deep in nature as breath. So even more so observing the breath, but realizing that For a Taoist, the breath in and the breath out between yin and yang resides the Wu Ji. That is that unified state. And to access that, you pause. And when you pause, you consume and start to energize the physical body through this transmutation of that energy, because the breath carries everything. It's very, very dense, very rich. Just this union we're having right now when we're speaking, there's a density in this communion that we're having in this conversation. There's a palpable density in the energy that is present. So we're just speaking on this stuff, it's like, oh, there's what my parapsychologist friends would refer to as psychokinesis. There's something going on here. There's an agreement or a consensus of there's something more than just what we believe is the computer, the internet, your backdrop, my face. These are actually unified. They're not separated. And so how do you quickly access the ability of the now moment that is, first person, third person, no person, is something as primordial and as rich and as ancient as the breath. And between the breath in and the breath out, we accumulate what we call absorption of the riches, where you are now starting to saturate what we call chi packing, and you'll start to feel it through the body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact, I have a few things to say about that. One is that I think the most important part of meditation techniques, and especially of breathing techniques, is the hold, the still point. It's like in the Kriya Yoga tradition, they talk about the right nostril connects to the right hand channel of Pingala, and the left nostril relates more so to Ida, the feminine principle, and the mouth breathing is more so the middle channel. That's a simplification. But when I used to teach, I don't teach it anymore, and that's for various reasons. But when I used to teach meditation techniques, I would really emphasize the importance of that point of holding the breath and remaining still, whether that's for 5 seconds or 30 seconds. You just, after you've been doing, let's say, alternate breathing, which is a powerful technique for bringing energies into the middle of the spine, and then sitting still, absolutely still as possible, only your heart is beating, holding the breath for at least a few seconds, if not 15, 20 seconds. That is, I think, where the real awakening can occur. An anecdote here that was incredibly helpful for me, very practical. When I graduated from art school, I had tremendous stage fright when I was younger, and I just couldn't get up in front of people. It's who knows what the pattern there was. But I had to get up to accept my diploma on the stage, and I was totally freaked out. I was, 20, 21, 22. And I was sweating, and I was almost at the point of shaking. I was so nervous about this. And so I went off into the men's bathroom, and I sat on the toilet, and I did alternate breathing for like 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes before I got up. And it was unbelievable, the change it had for me, in terms of, I walked out of the men's bathroom just in a blissful state, because I had focused so much on that technique of alternate breathing. And again, the stillness, it was the point after I did that for maybe 10 minutes, and then I just sat in stillness, and all that emotionality that I had up till that point just dissolved away. And so breathing is an extraordinary thing. And so I just wanted to throw that into the mix too, in terms of both the esoteric side of, I think it does actually help bring the energies into the spinal column, as a physical ritual, just bringing your hands together in namaste. This is the right hand channel, this is the left hand channel. You bring the hands together. That automatically helps to bring the energies into the middle. But also on that emotional, practical level of keeping you from going crazy from emotionality in everyday situations and everyday dramas. I find to this day, I still use that alternate breathing if I feel I need to relax. I'll sometimes do it before a big interview or a podcast thing if I feel like my mind is scattered. Fortunately, I wasn't in that state today, but so anyway.
Yeah, there's nothing more profound. And we take it a little bit further and go deeper into it. So we start entering past the respiration and you breathe from, pure consciousness that acquire that. And that's a mastered state.
Yeah, I'm not at that level.
Yeah. And it's completely possible for anyone. I always tell people, if you have a nervous system and you are human, you can access these states of awareness. It's a method of cultivation. It's whether you meet your own patience for yourself to make that a viable option. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I know of that process, but I certainly haven't attained to that level yet.
Yeah, it's not something that's for a few or many. It just determines where you're at and what is most important. It's like, I remember the birth of my first son, and he's just turning 13, and I have 6 children. And I remember when he was born, and he resided between my wife and I in the bed. And I was talking to one of my teachers. I channel my teacher, Latsu, and I'm like, so exactly when am I going to have time to do all this hours of cultivation in the altar and all this kind of stuff? He's like, you are experiencing your cultivation right now. And I'm like, wow, okay. And that just built on itself. And every incredible being, every child that entered into my world was another teacher to bring me back to that potency of empathy and the facets of that go so deep in compassion and love. But the truth of it is, these are all throwaway hallmark identities until you truly are expressing and admitting this resonance that is a default, that is in servitude and selflessness. Other than that, you're going to be trapped in this construct and this torturing sort of symbiosis between yin and yang, and I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm emotional, I'm not emotional. There's always a variable that comes with your what we call the human condition. And as you acquire from that human condition your Sherlock to your Watson, the elementary realization through the labyrinth of the mind, you come out the other side and your human beingness is unified. That secret, sweet realization of sentience and ultimately empathy, and truly being able to oscillate with that, like an undulated flame that just sort of flickers back and forth and is moving in and out from this incredible moment, always being able to center. And that flame is that burning desire. And we call that the anchor to the truth, to everything.
Yeah. No, that's beautifully said. I'm not sure what to add to that. That's very eloquent.
Well, thank you, my friend. Well, let's briefly, I'm not sure how much time we have, maybe another 10 minutes or 5 minutes.
That sounds good. Yeah.
Let's add a little bit of astrology to this conversation.
I was just thinking of that, actually. Yeah.
And so with your insight, and I mean, you've been teaching and exploring the power of the human being's relationship with the stars for so many years. What do you find is the most potent? Because everything is a variable, in my opinion. There's nothing set in stone. Would you like to explore a little bit more of your insight as to how this is a method of helping someone understand the nature of reality?
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, because that's exactly what I was thinking of maybe bringing up here. Astrology is not a spiritual path in terms of, it's not a practice. You're not going to, find enlightenment by doing horoscopes, so to speak. But it's an invaluable tool for understanding not only human nature, but I think the universe, in the sense that imagine if you found out that there was a book somewhere that someone had that laid out your life and who you were and what you were going to do, what your personality was going to be like, your strengths and your weaknesses. And someone had this book, and it said everything really there was to say about you in terms of your personality and life destiny. would it be a good thing or a bad thing to find that book? I have a chapter that works with this thought experiment, Stumbling Across the Script, I think it's called. And it depends on what you do with it. You know, there's a certain existential shock that would happen, which happened to me when I learned astrology, when you realize, whoa, this person is looking at these symbols on a piece of paper and they're telling me all about me in terms of who I am and what's happened the last few months. And I mean, if you really stop to think about it, that'll really be a reality check, because it makes you question, well, hey, you know, am I just programmed? It also, the other big insight was it made me realize I'm somehow connected to the cosmos. You know, there's a number of insights that kind of can naturally unfold from this. And there's real value to that if someone wants to learn from that. It's, for some people, it's just a pastime, like, you know, sun sign astrology and the magazines and that sort of thing. But it's a way to understand why we're wired the way we are. It's also a very valuable way for increasing self-awareness in a psychological sense, because a person may think they know themselves, and then they look at their chart and they realize the chart does kind of tell them what they already knew, but it also tells them a lot about what they didn't know about themselves. Or, for example, you might have a Mars coming up to square your moon, for instance, which my one teacher used to say, if you ever want to show someone the efficacy of astrology, just tell them when Mars is going to be coming up to square their moon, because everybody always, it takes a rare soul that can rise above that and not be triggered by that energy in terms of anger. And so you see this energy coming up. It could be that, it could be something else. And you realize, whoa, I really am programmed. That Mars comes up to square the moon and I just get angry, and I thought I wasn't going to. I thought for sure I was in control of my emotions, and I wasn't. So it's an ongoing tool in self-awareness in that sense. Like I say, astrology won't make you enlightened, but it will certainly give you self-awareness. And it will also, I think, has real practical benefits in terms of when to do things, when not to do things for the greatest benefit of the outcome. But it also, I think it's for me, it's been an invaluable tool in understanding how the cosmos works. And it ties into the whole notion of the chakras. You know, the horoscope is a diagram of your chakras in some sense. If you spin the zodiac around so that Leo and Cancer are at the top of the circle, and that you have the chakra compartments laid out, you know, the 2 Saturn-ruled chakras at the bottom, Aquarius, Capricorn, the 2 Jupiter-ruled chakras, compartments, I should say, Sagittarius and Pisces. On it goes until you get to Cancer, Leo at the top for the sun and the moon chakras. So it's kind of a key, an esoteric key to cosmology for me, at the same time as it's an invaluable psychological tool. My first astrology teacher was a woman at the university. She had been at the University of Chicago, Maureen Clearly. She's now passed on. But she had been a brilliant psychologist, and she essentially gave up her practice as a psychologist to become a full-time astrologer. She was in her mid-20s. She was teaching with some of the greatest minds on the planet at the time, Mircea Eliade and James Hillman and Victor Turner, and, you know, brilliant intellectuals. And here she was, a 25-year-old woman teaching alongside these people. So she came from this very rigorous intellectual background, came into astrology, became a brilliant astrologer, what we would call a psychological astrologer, whereas my teachers, Kriyananda and Shelley, were not psychologically oriented quite as much. They were more so into the esoteric and the practical, those 2 ends of the spectrum. And she was kind of covering the middle territory there, the psychological. But so it's been a key to many different mysteries for me, not just you know, fortune telling or whatever that might be. So so that's in a nutshell how I would summarize the astrological. You may have any questions though about pressing me about any of those points. I'm not sure what else to say about that offhand.
Yeah, no, it's always fascinating finding a way to decipher your own sense of what is true, what is not true. It generally falls in that evidence space. From belief to knowing requires an experience. And so you hold these beliefs and until they're met with something that would polarize it, equal to or greater than, you'll continue to stay there and, repeat the same behaviors like Groundhog Day. So when you get an incredible tool like, being able to decipher the universe with this ancient knowledge, you feel a level of grounding and a robust sort of awareness that, wow, okay, well, this is an option. But then furthermore, through more experience, you start to realize, okay, well, that's one option. Is this a permanence? Well, it's determined by my belief into my knowing from the experience of what the universe is doing. So can I change it? What are the possibilities of me changing this fate that has been set out for me? And that's, I think, where you get the moment where you say, well, when these align, I've never seen anyone rise to this virtuous selflessness without being commandeered by the emotional state of anger due to how this works when these energies are aligned. And, I always tell people, Master, your emotions don't control you, you control your emotions. And that is a very paradox for most people.
Yeah. Boy, there's so much I could say. For me, the study of astrology has unfolded along a parallel track to my studies in synchronicity. Mm. So I've written a lot about synchronicity, and I see those two subjects as being in tandem, astrology and synchronicity, because astrology really rests upon the ancient doctrine of correspondences, which is that everything has such symbolic correlates. So, the sun, an astronomer looks at the sun and sees it as a class C star, whatever it is. It's related to other stars by certain physical attributes and characteristics and that, whereas an esotericist, an occultist would look at the sun and see it related to things like gold, to kingdom, to queendom, to rulership, to lions, to the heart. There's a series of these mysterious analogies in nature. And so the scientist isn't wrong in seeing those kind of literal connections of things, but the esotericist, with the eye of metaphor and analogy, looks beyond the surface meanings and literal connotations to these deeper sort of patterns, so that your entire world is a synchronistic one. There's always symbolic correspondences going on. There's always synchronistic patterns in your life. Now, it sometimes emerges into visibility more prominently, like at the tip of an iceberg, like Carl Jung's famous story about the woman that was resistant to her therapy, and she dreamt of a scarab beetle. And as she was telling him this story, there was a beetle tapping on the window of the therapy room, and he went and grabbed it and said, "Here's your beetle." And it had this effect of kind of breaking through her resistance. So synchronicities do happen in terms of those dramatic, one in a million type of things. And I've had some incredible stories along those lines. But astrology really showed me that synchronicity is an ever-present, constant sort of phenomena. And once you transition to that eye of metaphor, that eye of symbolism, you start seeing these things. You realize that, you might have, a car might go by outside and it's smoke coming out of the engine and it catches on fire the same day that you drop a knife on the floor and cuts your toe. Or you might get angry at some, telemarketer, they're called, whatever. These are all connected by Mars, for example. But to someone that doesn't understand the language of symbolism, they're not going to realize there's a fabric there, a tapestry of synchronicities that are you're swimming through at all times in your life.
Yeah. No, it's a never-ending discovery, and we just, as we regress back to the simplicity of contracting and expanding, the bellows effect, we refer to it as the completion and birth that is happening constantly, never ending, and your ability, and I think that's where that synchronistic moment comes, the Wu Wei, your ability to dissolve everything else and then enter into that center point, that vesicle, will show you some type of magical mystery that would possibly just be a contemplation in your mind that can be materialized. And you're like, wow, that didn't seem like it would be possible, yet being in that present moment doesn't require any participation from you. And then that paradox comes in. And then we go back into, well, how are we going to get there? Well, we'll start with the breath and cultivation. And it can turn into the most incredible self-realization. You know, the Schumann resonance, which you're familiar with, is something that pretty much programs the human as they wake up, and their position on planet Earth will determine their circadian rhythm and their pacing and leading of what is that frequency. An average, I think 7.83, something to that effect, which would be a theta to alpha brainwave. In that category, you are now potential. But what does potential really mean if you add coffee, sugar, and the general consensus that that may be the admission of the Earth, yet the basic status of any human being when they wake up is generally a beta brainwave. So now you're contending with these 2, 3, or 4 elements that can change your experience for that day. It can be variable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In fact, I want to ask you, from your background and your tradition, if someone were listening to this and they said, what is the most effective way to cultivate that Wu Wei sort of connection in their everyday life, what would you say based on your own understanding?
You take a very basic exercise, and you imagine you don't have a past or a future. And here we have the evidence. You fall into the breath, you hold the breath, and all of a sudden your worries, your anxiety, your fear will disappear instantaneously just from that simple exercise. And if you perform it enough, you will acquire and capture that resonance that is really your default. All you're doing is remembering this. And when you remember it, it becomes second nature, as does an autonomous autonomic process that would come from your nervous system that would be in the category of an unconscious ability. But furthermore, the dominion, the imperium of mastery comes from merging the conscious and unconscious as one, which would then emanate itself in a brainwave that would be 40 hertz or above. And, you know, that's where I start to see some pretty radical miracles when I'm transmitting a brainwave 40 to 100 hertz. You start to go, wow, anything is possible. And I've been measuring my brainwaves for many years, and that's when the secret sauce really starts to be palpable, and you start to see things that most confession, as you said, through your own admission, you'd experience some other sort of things, maybe LSD or other things of that nature back in the day. Psychonautic behavior is a past hobby of many people attempting to access ascension. Yet it's a temporary, impermanent sort of experience where you put your foot in the door and then the door closes on you. So how do you really cultivate something that can be more permanent? Is accessing it through that alchemical process, and you will develop an ability to hold that and then witness it. And it's not a path of, you know, decades of practice, but you must be given the fundamental elements that will make it tangible for you, because you want to experience it. It needs to be repeatable for you not to be deluded and you know, contorted and distorted by this noise, because you keep making it up in your mind. You have no evidence to prove that it's actually true to you, let alone the rest of the world. So that's where a method to the madness always comes into it, that ability. So when you capture the present moment, it can come from the breath. And you know, the idea of just imagine there's no past or future, just now. What happens? Your mind becomes blank. There's really nothing to go to. It's like, whoa, hang on a second. And then if you capture what we call the fa jin, the substance, we access that Wu way, it starts to emanate and transfer through the cells of the body, and you will capture a vibratory effect that will start to be more and more evident. The more and more you hold, the more and more you are able to absorb, what we call absorbing the riches. You will see it as the now, you'll go, holy moly, it can't be this simple. Oh, yes, it is. It's really, there's nothing more, because you're feeling it. It's not the nonsense that your mind might contort or create as an idea or how it's supposed to be. Your body is emanating it, and that's where you get more evidence than any other experience, in my opinion.
This may only be a baby step, but it's still, I think, the single best thing a person can do if they're not ready to go off into a monastery or do complicated practices. Even if they just took 1 or 2 minutes every morning after getting out of bed to slow down and maybe hold their breath for 20 seconds and just try to be, like you were saying, in that present moment, not thinking about the past or future or the day ahead, and just keeping the mind still to start off the day for 15, 20 seconds, I think is a big step. It may not seem like much, but you multiply that, let's say 20 seconds times 365 times. And that adds up to a lot of time spent by the end of the year in stillness there. And then again, maybe before you go to bed at night too. So I just want to add that to the mix.
Yeah, no, it will absolutely show you evidence. It's a very powerful exercise that enters into something that's beyond what we're experiencing from a humanistic perspective. Yet separating yourself from your human experience is also problematic, and I wouldn't suggest it. Most people, the virtue signal, and I've taken the shirt off my back. God, can you not hear me? I am here. I am worthy. And of course, as you grasp for it like the flame, it will be elusive. It will move around. You can't grasp it, just like sand in your hand. It will fall out of your hand and disappear. It's when you become still that you find that, oh my goodness, it's all accessible to me. Or furthermore, one of my teachers would say, when you accept you know nothing, you know everything. And that's very
Taoistic.
Yes. Well, it's been so fascinating today, my friend. I'm very grateful that you accepted my invitation, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Can I finish with one question? What's your definition of spiritual consciousness?
Sure. I'm sorry, what's that?
What's your definition of spiritual consciousness?
That's a tricky one. It actually reminds me of something that you just said, kind of indirectly. Goswami Kriyananda made a comment once, which I thought was quite profound. He said, most people are trying to find God when they haven't even found their humanness yet. Which is that, I think another way of saying that is that, well, it's a holistic approach, an integral approach, which is that you don't separate your physical life, your ordinary life, from your spiritual life. It's an integration of the two. So if I say, well, my definition of spirituality, if I were to say it's this etheric, sort of ethereal, awareness of bliss and light, well, that's part of it. But there's also the experience of being a human and going through my humanity to kind of incorporate that as part of the so-called spiritual ethereal component. So it's my definition is very broad. It's that all-encompassing approach of, not just one or the other, but the two ends of the spectrum kind of brought together for what that's worth.
And that is perfect. Out of over 400 podcasts, I've never got the same answer as I should not. This is, you are unique, but a facet of the diamond of perfection.
Yeah.
We all have our own view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I want to thank you, my friend. I'm going to put all your interweb social sphere information under this podcast. Would you like to direct the audience to a specific book, a teaching, perhaps? Maybe you have something that you're embarking on most recently that you want to share with the audience.
Good question. Well, first of all, my website is just my name, raygrasse.com. Raygrasse. But my most recent book, which I don't have here. Anyway, I've written 2 books. My first book, The Waking Dream, is really a study in synchronicity. That's from 1996. And my most autobiographical book is called The Sky Stretched Out Before Me, where I talk about my encounter with these teachers and Joseph Campbell and my filmmaking school and all that. But my most recent book is called In the Company of Gods. It's my second book about Shelley Trimmer. It's a series of dialogues where he came to Chicago and gave us some talks, and the Q&A that happened, which I thought was really fascinating. And so the 2 books, if I had to recommend just 2 books, excuse me, it would be the 2 Shelley books, because there's a lot of wisdom in those books, and it's not mine, but it's wisdom. It's from these teachers in the Kriya tradition. An Infinity of Gods and In the Company of Gods are those 2 books. So that's what I'd say.
Oh, fantastic. I'll definitely have to pick those up and take a read. I am forever grateful for you, my friend. Thank you for spending time with me here today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And I want to thank you. I thank the universe for bringing you into my life. I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. And I am your humble servant and Sifu Taoist Master San Qing. And I'll see you in the next one, guys.